transgender people about the murder of Rita Hester in November of 1998. She talked about how similar the death was of that of Chanel Pickett just 3 years before. Both were transgender women of color who had lived in Massachusetts, were last seen alive at a neighborhood club, and died in mid-November. No one she spoke to or knew remembered Chanel Pickett, even though the trial of her murderer, William Palmer, had ended only months before Hester's death. It seemed clear to her that when we are forgetting our past, and we're, to paraphrase George Santana, doomed to repeat it. Transgender people are those whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. In 1999, a handful of transgender people sought to highlight the need for awareness around anti-transgender violence, which refers to attacks against people who are perceived as transgender, regardless of how one may be personally identified. To that end, the first Transgender Day of Remembrance event was held in the Castro district of San Francisco, holding the names of those we lost in silent testimony. That was 16 years ago. Transgender Day of Remembrance will be presented in the United States and Canada, Australia, Poland, Russia, the Philippines, South Korea, and many other locations around the earth. The notion of remembering our dead reaches into places that those few who gathered in 1999 could hardly have envisioned. We've seen an increase in legislation that helps prosecute those who participated in anti-transgender violence, including Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Acts. We've seen a much greater awareness of the issue of anti-transgender violence. We've even seen success in other battles for transgender rights. Yet, we still see anti-transgender violence. Every year, we still find ourselves with a list of people who have been violently murdered for simply being themselves. The Transgender Day of Remembrance is not an event for fundraisers and beer busts. It is not an event we celebrate. It is not a quick and easy one-day way for organizations to get credit for their support of the transgender community. It's not something to trot out on the 20th of November and forget about. We should be working every day for all of us, living and dead. Why do we remember? We remember for Rita Hester and Chanel Pickett. We remember for Brandon Tina. And we remember for Gwen Gerald. We remember for hundreds of others killed around the world in anti-transgender murders. This day we mourn our losses and we honor our precious dead. Tomorrow and every other day we shall continue to fight for the living. 20 transgender people have already been reported murdered this year in the United States. This is a trans murder 3-year spike. Concerned advocates say that they have an epidemic on their hands, one that appears to be getting worse and disproportionately affecting women of color. Complicating their efforts to tackle the crisis, police and the media face unique challenges in bringing justice for these victims and their families. A Fusion analysis found that at least 20 transgender women have been killed this year. 9 of those investigations have led to murder charges. For comparison, there were 14 trans women murdered on record all of last year. According to the New York City Anti-Violence Project, which began to collect data on attacks against transgender people 2 decades ago. In 2013, the group found that there were at least 12 hate-motivated homicides of transgender women, and they were all people of color. Following is a list of 20 of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals who have been killed this year in the United States. And I will light a candle for each innocent life if I say their name. Tamara Dominguez from Kansas City, Missouri. Alicia Walker, Johnsontown, North Carolina. Candace Capri, Phoenix, Arizona. Amber Monroe, Detroit, Michigan. Shane Schuler, Dallas, Texas. Casey Haggard, Fresno, California. India Clark, Tampa, Florida. Ashton O'Hara, Detroit, Michigan. Mercedes Williamson, George County, Mississippi. London Kiki Chanel, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Myra Hall, Fort Meade, Maryland. Keisha Blige, Aurora, Illinois. Christina Ringwald, Miami-Dade, Florida. Brian Golick, Akron, Ohio. Penny Proud, New Orleans, Louisiana. Taja Jesus, San Francisco, California. Yasmin Bash Payne, Los Angeles, California. Ty Nooney Underwood, Taylor, Texas. Lima Byrd, Norfolk, Virginia. And Poppy Edwards, Louisville, Kentucky. And that's in the United States. We went all over the world. It'd be a great many more. And I'm not going to tell you how they were all murdered, just to say that. The murders are violent. More violent than you can imagine, because it's out of hate. It's hard to say whether the rising number of trans women being murdered represents an actual spike in killings, or whether they are the result of more awareness and documentation. But transgender women of color are particularly vulnerable to violence. The civil rights group Southern Poverty Law Center analyzed 14 years of FBI statistics and found that LGBT people are more than twice as likely to be attacked in a violent hate crime as blacks or Jews, and more than 4 times as likely as Muslims. Multiple studies have also found transgender women of color consistently face the highest rate of violence among the LGBT community. Transgender people of color were 1.6 times more likely to experience physical violence when compared to other members of the LGBT community, according to AVP's latest analysis. Of the 20 trans women killed this year, 17 were black or Latina. The remaining 3 were white. The murders have taken place across the country, including cities with large LGBT populations like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Miami. And you heard there was one in Akron this year as well. They're just the homicides that have been documented. The numbers don't include trans men or murder cases in which the victim may have been misgendered. They also don't include transgender people who were shot, stabbed, or brutally attacked and left for dead but survived. I'm part of a community that's seen a large number of murders. I pay taxes like everyone else, and I'm not doing anything to hurt anybody, so why don't I have the same protections? Asked Brianna Jane, a transgender woman based in Los Angeles. Because our society is finally starting to pay attention to transgender people and the issues they face, we are more aware of the deadly violence transgender women of color have faced for a very long time. There are many barriers to tracking reports of homicide of transgender people, and we are only recently getting a more accurate picture of the problems that Che Ginger sought. These barriers range from personal family issues to systemic institutional practices. Police departments often hesitate to identify trans women as women, often because legal forms like birth certificates don't match up with their gender identity, even in cases when the victim clearly presents as a woman. And because the statements the media receives from police agencies misgender victims. News stories often don't include accurate gender identity details. In some cases, family members have requested the LGBT community not claim a trans homicide victim as one of their own. Many victims could have been in early stages of transitioning and exploring their identity, but because they lack the support from loved ones and organizations, they may not have felt safe to fully express their gender identity. In my case, I fully identify as a trans woman, so if I become a victim, then I'll be counted because I've been open about it for the last 3 years. But if I didn't have my family, I don't know if that would be the case of Gutierrez, who says she worries about her safety when she steps out of her apartment in Los Angeles. Transgender women of color are particularly vulnerable to violence because they represent the intersection of other marginalized groups that already face a hard time. They're Black and Latino women, for example, two groups facing some of the highest unemployment rates, who will also have a tougher time finding health care and housing than white women, and they have the added layer of being transgender. Trans women of color are at the intersection of multiple oppressions, explains Stacey Long Simmons, Policy Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force, an LGBT civil rights group based in Washington, D.C. All those layers on one individual identity can place you at the center of a lot of lifestyle challenges, says Simmons. The largest study on trans people in the United States that surveyed more than 6,400 individuals found 15% of Black trans people and 16% of Latina trans people have been physically assaulted at work. 1 in 5 trans people experience homelessness, and 38% of Black trans people and 29% of Latino trans people have been refused a home or apartment due to bias. LGBT advocates say they can't pinpoint why there's a spike in reported killings this year, but they say they hope it's not a backlash to the greater visibility of the LGBT community. We may not have the answers as to why these killings keep on happening, but that shouldn't stop us from taking action now to stop this rising trend, Simmons said. We need to make sure the homicide investigations are handled respectfully, responsibly, and swiftly. Keeping up with these investigations is difficult. LGBT advocacy groups already struggle to keep living transgender women safe. And there are even fewer resources when it comes to making sure police departments are following up on murder investigations. I will end with a statement from Reverend Peter Morales on International Transgender Day of Remembrance. Living authentically takes courage, strength, and above all faith, said Reverend Paula Engston Daly in an email to supporters of the UUA's Standing on the Side of Love campaign. His words resonate with me because they are at once encouraging yet terribly sad. Sad because as Unitarian-Universalists and other people of faith commemorate International Transgender Day of Remembrance, I'm reminded that in a society still clinging to rigid ideas about gender, our brothers and sisters who are gender nonconforming risk their very lives just to honor their authentic selves. Anti-transgender violence is a stunning epidemic, embodying the darkest aspects of human nature. Perpetrators of such violence have succumbed to the moral plagues of fear, hatred, and cruelty, turning away from love and compassion. Sadly, the victims of their murderous rage are too often forgotten by society at large. They leave behind friends, family, and an entire community who also feel targeted. Despite this, I am encouraged. I hold fiercely to the belief that our society is becoming more compassionate and aware. Unitarian Universalists are joined by like-minded people every day who value the inherent dignity and worth of all. We have much work to do, and progress is slow, but I believe we will win this fight. He goes on to say, Unitarian Universalists have long dreamed of a society in which our most valued qualities are those of character. Now we must do more than dream. As long as anyone is harassed or ridiculed, we must demand an end to the bullying. As long as anyone is judged because of their gender identification or presentation, we must insist on a higher moral standard. And if, God forbid, anyone is ever again physically harmed or murdered because of his or her gender identity or expression, we must rise up and seek justice. We must put our faith into action, not just on this day of remembrance, but every day, in memory of those who have been murdered, to all those who feel their loss, and to all those who still struggle with oppression, you are not alone. We are with you, standing on the side of love.